South Africa's war in Angola did not begin at a single identifiable border crossing. It began in the unease of a regime that saw every liberation movement beyond its frontier as a direct threat to its grip at home. It began in the boardrooms and war rooms where strategists converted political isolation into a logic of preemption. It began in refugee camps, clandestine training grounds, and in the dusty tracks traced by guerrilla bands moving across a landscape that had been carved by empire. To understand the dark truth of that war is to see how an apartheid state extended its security apparatus outward until the fight it thought would stay foreign became profoundly domestic, and how a remote theater in southern Africa turned into a crucible of Cold War confrontation. After the Second World War, the world that had created empires started to unravel. European colonial systems faced organized, often violent demands for self-government across Asia and Africa. In South Africa, the 1948 election that brought the National Party to power enshrined apartheid into law, a system of racial hierarchy and strict segregation that hardened the state's identity and its response to dissent. Internationally, decolonization stirred new alignments. Liberation movements embraced ideologies and international patrons that reflected the bipolar logic of the Cold War. Some looked to Moscow and Havana for support, others to Western backers who saw anti-communism as the highest priority. South Africa's white minority rulers watched these developments with alarm. By the 1960s, apartheid's domestic repression had produced a steady stream of exiles and militants. The Sharpeville massacre of 1960, when police opened fire on a crowd protesting pass laws, killing and wounding many, and the later Soweto uprising in 1976 became international symbols of a regime under moral siege. The United Nations and many states increasingly framed apartheid not as a purely internal matter, but as a breach of human rights warranting collective response. For Pretoria, international censure translated into practical isolation, diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions in some quarters, and a growing sense that survival required both internal control and external buffers. That logic of defending the homeland by fighting beyond the frontiers would become a defining feature of South African strategy. The state's leaders and security planners saw African liberation movements as interconnected threads. Success for one could inspire others and weaken the borders that protected the apartheid order. Southwest Africa, the territory known today as Namibia, was not merely a neighboring colony, it was in South African eyes an outpost of existential vulnerability. Namibia's status after World War II was a legal and political anomaly. The League of Nations had entrusted Southwest Africa to South African administration under a mandate system.
After the Second World War, the United Nations sought to transform mandates into trusteeships and to supervise transitions to independence. South Africa resisted. Over time, Pretoria treated Namibia increasingly as a fifth province, subjecting it to apartheid laws, attracting white settlers, and effectively annexing the territory, despite international objections. For Namibians and their sympathizers, the denial of political rights and the imposition of an alien legal order created both the grievance and a resolve. Out of that resolve emerged the Southwest Africa People's Organization, known by its acronym SWAPO. Founded in the late 1950s and gaining broader traction in the 1960s, SWAPO became the principal nationalist formation demanding self-determination for Namibia. Its armed wing, the People's Liberation Army of Namibia, PLAN, adopted guerrilla tactics suited to a protracted struggle against a better-equipped, state-backed security apparatus. Early PLAN operations were limited in scope: raids across the northern border, sabotage of infrastructure, and attempts to inspire local resistance. These actions were financed and supplied through a network of sympathetic states and diaspora communities. Training camps were scattered across friendly African capitals and in exile enclaves. South Africa's response evolved in tandem. Initially, the administration relied on police units and paramilitary auxiliaries to confront insurgency. But as the conflict expanded and tactics shifted, the militarization of policy accelerated. The South African Defence Force, SADF, the formal military establishment, increasingly took the lead. A defensive posture hardened into a proactive one: cut lines and fortified boundaries, interior security operations, and a willingness to pursue insurgents into neighboring territories if those territories were perceived as safe havens for opposition forces. The concept of a buffer territory, a physical space beyond South Africa's border that would absorb or deter militant pressure, became more than a passive idea. In practice, it meant repeated cross-border raids, intelligence operations, and the cultivation of local proxies. For Pretoria, the logic was straightforward: deny sanctuary to guerrilla forces, interdict supply lines, and destroy the organizational capacity to project violence back into South Africa. The moral and legal cost of this logic would be paid in public reputation and in a series of operations that would stretch South African forces across hundreds of miles. If Namibia provided the proximate cause of South African insecurity, the events in Portugal in 1974, the Carnation Revolution, created the setting for a far broader and bloodier contest. Portugal's sudden political turnover ended decades of colonial rule in Africa almost overnight. Angola, a Portuguese colony, plunged into a violent scramble for control.
Three major factions vied for power: the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, with Marxist orientations and support from the Soviet Union and Cuba; the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, which attracted regional and Western sympathies at various times; and the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, FNLA, another contender with its own foreign backers. What might have been an Angolan civil conflict became almost immediately a separate theater in the Cold War. Allies and patrons saw the struggle as an opportunity or a test of influence. South Africa watched developments in Angola closely because the balance there had direct implications for Namibia. If the MPLA, backed by Soviet arms and Cuban advisors, consolidated power in Luanda, South African planners feared the opening of a southern flank for SWAPO and for Soviet-aligned forces. This fear was not merely theoretical. By late 1975, as Portuguese withdrawal accelerated, large numbers of armed groups and displaced populations moved across Angola's territory. Foreign actors flowed in to tip the balance in their favored directions. South African strategists believed that intervention could prevent an outcome they saw as disastrous for regional security, as defined by Pretoria. Operation Savannah, the code name for South Africa's covert intervention in Angola in late 1975, was the first overt expression of that belief. Under the cover of deniability, and with a mix of mechanized units, special forces, and air assets, the SADF crossed into Angola to support anti-MPLA forces and to influence the post-colonial settlement in ways sympathetic to Pretoria's interests. The operation's early phase achieved surprising territorial gains. Columns moved quickly through the Angolan interior, linked up with local militias, and captured towns previously held by rival forces. For South African commanders, these advances appeared to vindicate a doctrine of limited surgical intervention: strike decisively, support friendly proxies, and withdraw before the international costs escalated. But the rapid territorial thrust carried a political and strategic risk. What began as a clandestine effort to shape a neighboring transition quickly attracted the attention of other external powers. Cuba, under the leadership of Fidel Castro, responded with a significant deployment of troops and artillery to reinforce the MPLA government. Soviet logistical and material support followed. The Angolan battlefield transformed. No longer a patchwork of local wars, it became a theater where superpower interests intersected with regional security calculations. The entry of Cuban forces would prove decisive. Their arrival stabilized the MPLA and complicated South Africa's ability to hold gains made during Operation Savannah. Even before Cuba's mass mobilization, the pattern that would mark the broader conflict was becoming clear.
South African units operating inside Angola were often able to inflict damage on opposition infrastructure and to capture or disrupt important nodes. Yet the political gains were fragile, easily erased by the arrival of fresh, better supported forces. At home, Pretoria portrayed its cross-border strikes as necessary to prevent terrorism and to protect its citizens from the effects of insurgency. Internationally, however, those same operations drew condemnation. The image of an apartheid regime using its military to influence the fate of neighboring peoples reinforced the narrative of a state unwilling to abide by the norms of decolonization and self-determination. This international reaction crystallized in several policy moves. The United Nations, over the course of the 1970s, increased its scrutiny of apartheid and of South Africa's regional interventions. Diplomatic isolation translated into trade constraints and arms embargoes in certain quarters. Notably, UN Security Council Resolution 418, adopted in 1977, imposed a mandatory arms embargo against South Africa. The resolution reflected a growing consensus that apartheid's external aggression could not be separated from its internal oppression, and it sought to curtail Pretoria's ability to purchase weapons and materiel on the open market. In practice, enforcement of embargoes could be uneven, and South Africa developed a sophisticated network of clandestine procurement. But the symbolic and practical effects were significant. The regime faced limits on overt supply channels and a new level of international opprobrium. At the same time, internal debates within South Africa hardened. Security officials argued that a defensive posture was insufficient. The state's thinking shifted toward what would be termed total strategy, an approach combining military action abroad, intensified internal security measures, and efforts to restructure political life to withstand both internal unrest and external pressure. Although the phrase would gain wider currency under later leaders, the seeds of a comprehensive security doctrine were already evident. Fighting outside the borders was part of maintaining the apartheid state's survival. In the borderlands, those ideological and policy shifts had concrete consequences. Caecilian cut lines, heavily guarded buffer zones, and fortified patrol posts marked the countryside. New units emerged that blurred the line between police and military roles. One of the most controversial of these was Kovwit, Afrikaans for crowbar, a counterinsurgency unit deployed in Namibia and later in Angola, whose aggressive tactics and allegations of human rights abuses made it a lightning rod for criticism. Reported at the time as a specialized anti-guerrilla force, Kovwit operated with a degree of autonomy that raised questions about oversight and accountability.
Accusations of extrajudicial killings, tortured detainees, and heavy-handed policing were levied by opponents and later human rights investigators. Pretoria consistently defended its counterinsurgency methods as responses to a violent threat. For SWAPO and Plan, the geography of struggle was changing. Initially dependent on operations staged from neighboring Zambia, Tanzania, and other sympathetic countries, Plan increasingly shifted some operational basing into southern Angola as the chaotic end of Portuguese rule provided both opportunity and shelter. This relocation had tactical logic. Bases closer to Namibia reduced travel times for raids and improved supply reliability. It also made the insurgency less of an external nuisance and more of a regional problem, one that South Africa felt justified in answering with force. From the perspective of Namibians and their supporters, however, these were defensive adaptations by a movement seeking a liberated homeland. The rhetoric on both sides hardened. South African officials described their actions as preemptive measures against terrorism and a defensive shield for their citizens. SWAPO framed its struggle as a just war against colonial occupation and apartheid. International commentators varied. Some perceived South Africa's incursions as imperial overreach. Others, particularly those in anti-communist circles, emphasized the threat of Soviet and Cuban influence in southern Africa. Contemporary newspapers and dispatches showed how easily the local realities were subsumed into superpower narratives. Every skirmish, every airborne assault, every village attack became fodder for broader ideological claims. When Operation Savannah unfolded, the consequences of these entangled narratives became starkly visible. South African columns advanced through Angolan towns and countryside in late 1975, coordinating with anti-MPLA commanders and attempting to secure corridors that would limit the MPLA's ability to project power. On a tactical level, the SADF proved capable of deep operations. Paratroopers, mechanized units, and air support allowed for rapid movement across vast distances. Militarily, the operation demonstrated a proficiency that surprised many regional observers. Politically, it created a crisis. The presence of South African forces on Angolan soil galvanized international opinion and encouraged more direct involvement from outside actors. Within Luanda and on the MPLA side, reports suggest that the presence of South African units hardened resolve and accelerated requests for support from Cuba and the Soviet Union. Fidel Castro's government, citing ideological solidarity as well as strategic interest, answered with military advisors and swiftly with combat troops. Moscow's support in material and logistics followed.
The net effect was a rapid escalation. The Angolan conflict ceased being a local civil war and became a proxy arena in which superpower resources were mobilized in direct response to Pretoria's forward strategy. Short vignettes from those months captured the human texture behind the strategic maneuvers. In frontier settlements outside Windhoek and in the dusty Namibian homesteads, families tracked the movement of fighters and the rhythms of raids. Plan cadres, often young and steeped in the liberation discourse, spoke of duty and the difficult moral calculus of armed struggle. SADF soldiers, many conscripts drawn from the white population, received orders framed as defensive necessities, sent into unfamiliar terrain under the assumption that success would be swift and costs manageable. For civilians caught between these warring logics, daily life became a negotiation with danger. Markets emptied when columns were sighted, refugee flows increased, and the civilian toll mounted in ways that would, over time, erode the legitimacy of force in the eyes of many observers. Even as these operations played out on the ground, the legal and diplomatic disputes around them intensified. African states and the newly empowered non-aligned movement criticized South African actions as violations of sovereignty. The Organization of African Union, OAU, repeatedly condemned external interference in member states' affairs. Western governments, balancing Cold War priorities, issued measured rebukes mixed with pragmatic toleration in some quarters, a reflection of the uncomfortable choices in a bipolar world. On the other side, the Soviet bloc in Cuba framed their interventions as anti-imperialist support for national liberation. Propaganda and counter-propaganda amplified the stakes far beyond the immediate terrain. By the turn of 1976 into 1977, it was increasingly clear that a new phase had begun. South African forces had demonstrated tactical agility and the capacity to conduct cross-border operations, but the political costs were mounting. International censure, arms embargoes such as UN Security Council Resolution 418, and the visible presence of Cuban troops in Angola reframed the conflict's terms. What Pretoria had hoped would be a series of surgical actions to deter insurgency was morphing into an extended confrontation that implicated great power politics and carried reputational risks the regime had previously managed to contain. If the early years of this confrontation were a test of intent, a late 1970s would be a test of endurance. South Africa faced choices that would reverberate for a decade: double down on external military solutions and accept growing isolation, or recalibrate strategy in light of mounting costs and international pressure. Within the military establishment, plans proliferated for deeper incursions, airborne raids, and special operations designed to preempt and disrupt.
At the same time, voices within the political and economic elite, mindful of sanctions and the strain on resources, began to weigh the price of continued aggression. Amid these strategic debates, the human dimension continued to assert itself in ways that political calculus often marginalizes. Refugee streams from Angola and Namibia swelled refugee camps across the region, and these populations became both humanitarian challenges and political symbols. News of raids, ambushes, and reprisals circulated in international media, often accompanied by conflicting accounts. Some observers described attacks on camps and villages as indiscriminate or deliberately punitive. Others, including South African officials, argued that bases and combatants were embedded within civilian populations, complicating any moral absolutes. Certain incidents, most prominently attacks that would later be associated with places like Kasinga, became focal points for controversy, with competing narratives about the presence of fighters, the status of targets, and the scale of civilian suffering. Historians and investigators would later emphasize the contested nature of many such claims and the difficulty of establishing definitive facts amid the fog of wartime reportage. As the late 1970s approached, military innovation and adaptation went hand in hand with the deepening of diplomatic friction. The SADF refined its doctrine of cross-border raids, combining air mobility, mechanized columns, and reconnaissance to strike at supply lines and bases. Intelligence networks expanded. At the same time, Cuba's decision to commit significant ground forces and artillery put a brake on rapid South African advances. The battlefield was no longer merely a test of battlefield tactics. It was an arena where logistics, international solidarity, and political will would decide outcomes. And so the stage was set for a clash that would test the limits of South Africa's military reach and expose the moral ambiguities of a security policy that prioritized regime survival over the sovereignty of neighbors. The things that made Pretoria powerful, a well-equipped, professional military, and a willingness to operate beyond conventional political constraints, were the same things that would amplify the state's vulnerability as international opinion hardened and as adversaries marshaled external support. The war in Angola, then, was never merely a localized conflict. It was the external mirror of an internal crisis, and the ground where the apartheid state's strategic instincts would meet a coalition determined to resist its ambitions. If one wanted an emblem for this dark truth, it would be the image of paratroopers and mechanized columns moving into a landscape where the political contours were shifting faster than any operational plan.
The initial gains of late 1975 and early 1976 presaged a more protracted campaign. The choices made then to intervene covertly, to treat neighboring liberation movements as existential enemies, to accept the moral hazards of cross-border warfare, would bind South Africa to a costly course. If this historical arc raises hard questions, it is because those questions cut to the heart of how states calculate security and legitimacy. Was it possible for Pretoria to secure its frontiers without denying the political aspirations of those beyond them?
Could a regional order be constructed without outsiders and proxies turning local struggles into global tests? The answers would not come quickly, and in military terms, they would depend on the ability of either side to sustain operations across long distances and under intense international scrutiny. In political terms, the answers would be shaped by diplomatic maneuvers, shifting superpower strategies, and the endurance of popular movements. If you want the full chronology, the detailed battle maps, and the source-backed narrative that follows each operation from planning to aftermath, subscribe for the deep dive series that traces these events operation by operation and explores the contested claims with primary documents and contemporary dispatches. As 1976 turned into 1977, South African planners faced a mounting reality. Tactical successes could not guarantee strategic victory when opposing forces received external reinforcement. Cuba's willingness to send troops to support the MPLA, the Soviet Union's material backing, and the growing cohesion among African states against incursions into sovereign territory meant that unilateral cross-border tactics would increasingly encounter coordinated resistance. For a regime that had long relied on controlling narratives, at home through restricted media and legislation, abroad through diplomatic channels and covert procurement, the international spotlight became an operational constraint. Inside the SADF, assessments acknowledged both strengths and limits. Mechanized columns could conduct deep thrusts, airborne forces could seize airfields and logistical hubs, special operations units could disrupt supply flows. Yet sustaining such operations over extended periods required secure lines of supply and political cover that were eroding. The arms embargoes and the moral opprobrium against apartheid narrowed the diplomatic space Pretoria once maneuvered within. At a tactical level, the emergence of better-equipped MPLA formations, the presence of Cuban artillery and armored units, and the growing sophistication of anti-aircraft defenses in Angola changed the risk calculus for incursions. Across the Namibian border, SWAPO and PLAN recalibrated too. With bases in southern Angola more accessible and with increased training and supplies filtering through sympathetic states, PLAN operations became more organized.
Their raids rarely matched the scale of conventional military thrusts, but they relied on mobility, local knowledge, and the ability to blend with communities. From SWAPO's vantage point, each cross-border operation that reached Namibian villages or South African positions was not merely a tactical strike, but an assertion of legitimacy, a claim that the Namibian people would not accept Pretoria's rule indefinitely. The human cost continued to rise, even as debate raged over responsibility and proportionality. Refugee camps swelled, families fled contested territories, and incidents of civilian harm, sometimes the consequence of indiscriminate shelling, and sometimes of operations that blurred the civilian combatant line, fueled international outrage. South Africa consistently framed these outcomes as unfortunate but necessary. Opponents painted them as the predictable result of a policy that had chosen military dominance over political accommodation. By the time the late 1970s reached their midpoint, the international balance was tilting in a way that would shape the next phase of the conflict. Cuba's buildup in Angola, Soviet material support, and the tightening of international measures against Pretoria combined to create conditions that diminished the likelihood of a quick fix. Inside South Africa, the total strategy proponents argued for escalated action to avert perceived existential threats. Outside, African solidarity and superpower support for anti-apartheid and anti-apartheid movements strengthened the hand of those opposing Pretoria's extraterritorial operations. The stage was therefore set for a sequence of operations that would test endurance more than tactical flair. Cross-border raids would give way to large-scale battles, attritional engagements, and defensive campaigns around key nodes such as Quito-Quanavale. Political negotiations would eventually emerge, but only after a long and costly interlude in which reputation, legitimacy, and the human consequences of war became the central currencies of contestation. It was in that interlude where clandestine operations, contested incidents, and the moral ambiguities of counterinsurgency accumulated into a broader indictment that the darker truths of South Africa's Angola campaign became most apparent. If this historical arc raises hard questions, the next decade would provide some of the most painful and revealing answers. The 1980s were not a simple extension of the 1970s patterns, they were an intensification. South African tactics adapted, new units and doctrines were developed, and the battlefield in Angola evolved from fluid advances and raids into a grinding, attritional contest where artillery, logistics, and political will mattered more than sudden thrusts.
At the same time, international politics shifted. New formations of support for the MPLA, changing Soviet priorities under Mikhail Gorbachev, and a growing willingness among Western governments to press for negotiated solutions transformed the strategic calculus. Against that backdrop, a string of named operations, Protea, Daisy, Askari, Argon, and a catastrophic controversy at Kasinga exposed the contradictions of a policy that had sought to keep conflict at arm's length only to find it invaded domestic politics, international diplomacy, and the conscience of the world. Operation Reindeer in May 1978 is often remembered as the moment when South African airborne power and covert intent intersected most brutally. The largest single airborne assault mounted by the SADF in that era was directed against Kasinga, a site in southern Angola. Pretoria described Kasinga as a major plan, People's Liberation Army of Namibia, base and transit camp. SWAPO and other witnesses characterized it as a refugee camp, crowded with civilians and displaced people. Contemporary journalists, diplomats, and later historians have recorded both accounts and the fierce contestation that followed. South African paratroopers dropped from aircraft, mechanized units moved in, and the strike left a legacy of disputed claims that resonated far beyond the immediate tactical result. According to South African military sources, the operation destroyed a critical node in planned logistics. According to SWAPO, the operation massacred civilians. Independent observers, including elements of the international press and humanitarian agencies, reported scenes of chaos and large numbers of dead and wounded, but the exact composition of those killed, combatants, auxiliaries, refugees, remained the subject of competing narratives. The event crystallized a recurring feature of the conflict: battlefield ambiguity compounded by political contestation. Whatever the precise balance of combatant and non-combatant casualties, Kasinga became a symbol of the moral hazards inherent in cross-border counterinsurgency and a focal point for international condemnation of Pretoria's approach. The South African military response did not stop after Reindeer. In the early 1980s, the SADF adjusted its operational model. Rather than relying solely on single, spectacular raids, it pursued a combination of deep strikes designed to disrupt enemy infrastructure and longer, sustained operations intended to deny sanctuary. Operation Protea in 1981 epitomized this method. Targeting logistics hubs and command centers in southern Angola, Protea involved coordinated mechanized thrusts, heliborne insertions, and combined arms tactics aimed at degrading plans' capacity to plan and field cross-border raids into Namibia. Contemporary assessments by military analysts suggested that Protea achieved significant tactical objectives. Supply depots and training facilities were destroyed, and plans suffered material losses.
Yet the operation also illustrated the limits of purely military solutions. Even when installations were destroyed, networks rapidly reconstituted in other areas or relocated deeper into Angolan terrain. The SADF could impose losses, but it struggled to convert those tactical effects into a strategic debilitation of the insurgency. A few months later, Operation Daisy followed a similar pattern. It targeted transport nodes and sought to sever routes that linked plan bases to resupply channels. Again, the SADF demonstrated operational reach, logistical coordination, and the capacity to project force across difficult terrain. But such operations had a double cost. Militarily, they required heavy investment in fuel, maintenance, air support, and men. Politically, they hardened perceptions of Pretoria's willingness to violate sovereignty, fueling more overt diplomatic pushback from the African continent and the non-aligned movement. For South African policymakers, the calculus was fraught. Every effective strike reduced immediate threats, but deepened international isolation and made political solutions more difficult to negotiate on terms acceptable to Pretoria. By the middle of the decade, the conflict's character had shifted further. The Angolan government, backed by Cuban troops and Soviet materiel, was building a conventional capability that could contest space and hold ground in ways earlier insurgent formations could not. That capacity changed operational planning for the SADF. Where the 1970s had been defined by mobile raids and relatively limited ground engagements, the late 1980s brought larger, set-piece battles around fixed positions. The protracted fights around Quito-Quanavale, an airfield and surrounding strongpoints in southeastern Angola, became the central episode of this phase. What began as an attempt by UNITA, the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, to seize a strategic node with South African logistical support and advisory input, gradually became a focal point for Cuban and MPLA defense, and then for a larger confrontation with SADF elements supporting UNITA offensives. Quito Cuanavale and the surrounding area, often referenced along with the so-called Tumpo Triangle, were not accidental targets. Control of these nodes affected the ability to project mechanized units, to protect supply routes, and to threaten operational depth. For the SADF, influencing the outcome at Quito could constrain MPLA and Cuban freedom of movement and protect Namibia from increasing incursions. For the MPLA and its Cuban backers, holding Quito was essential to prevent a strategic encirclement and to protect southern Angola from becoming a staging ground for renewed offensives into the interior. The battles that developed in 1987-88 were marked by artillery duels, the extensive use of air power, and the deployment of armored formations under difficult conditions.
Cuban forces brought artillery units and coordination that had a decisive effect on the battlefield. Angolan air defenses grew in sophistication, and Soviet-supplied equipment supplemented Cuban tactics. The SADF, while highly professional and often superior in small unit maneuver, faced mounting difficulty in sustaining long-range offensive operations against opponents who could bring massed indirect fire and reserves into play. Minefields and anti-armor defenses slowed armored columns, and the logistics of supply across hundreds of kilometers of rough terrain multiplied attrition. Importantly, these battles were not isolated military episodes. They were invested with immense political significance. Each side framed the outcome as a measure of will and legitimacy. Media and political discourse in the region and abroad turned operational details into narratives of moral and geopolitical presence. Another emblematic event of the late 1980s that underscored the war's potential to spill into critical civilian infrastructure was the attack on the Kaluke hydropower and irrigation complex on the Angolan-Namibian border. Reports at the time indicated that aerial strikes damaged parts of the complex, killed or wounded soldiers and technicians, and highlighted how military action could threaten wider humanitarian and economic structures. The incident underscored the proximity of the fighting to infrastructures that served civilian populations and the potential for escalation to produce ripple effects beyond the immediate combatants. It also fed into a sense in Pretoria that the costs of continued operations were mounting in ways that surpassed narrow security calculations. Throughout these years, the SADF's internal composition and its auxiliary forces reflected the regime's determination to pursue a militarized foreign policy while also revealing its vulnerabilities. Units like Kovwit, which had been used in Namibia and later in certain Angolan operations, became notorious for their aggressive counterinsurgency methods. Human rights organizations and international observers reported alleged abuses by such units. Summary executions, torture, and extrajudicial measures were among the accusations frequently leveled. Pretoria defended these units as necessary tools against what it labeled terrorism, arguing that unconventional opponents required unconventional responses. Critics countered that the blurring of policing and battlefield roles, combined with a lack of clear legal accountability, produced cycles of violence that worsened rather than resolved the underlying political grievances. These battles mattered. They were part of the international discourse that shaped sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and the reputational cost Pretoria suffered. It is important to stress the role of external patrons in shaping the conflict's trajectory. Cuba's large-scale intervention in Angola was a crucial turning point.
Havana deployed thousands of troops, artillery pieces, and logistical support, and Cuban officers played a central role in organizing defensive and offensive operations alongside MPLA forces. Soviet logistical and material assistance complemented Cuban deployments, enhancing Angolan capacity to resist and to project force. On the other hand, the United States, driven by anti-communist priorities under the Reagan administration, maintained an ambivalent but consequential posture. Washington publicly supported negotiations and de-escalation later in the decade, but elements of U.S. policy also included covert and overt assistance to anti-MPLA actors such as UNITA at various points, reflecting the broader Cold War polarity. This mixture of support and conditional engagement complicated any straightforward narrative of Western neutrality and illustrates how local conflicts could become proxies for global rivalries. The arrival of Mikhail Gorbachev in the Soviet Union and his policies of perestroika and glasnost altered the strategic environment in ways that eventually opened space for diplomatic breakthroughs. Gorbachev's willingness to de-escalate overseas commitments and to negotiate arms reductions led the Soviet Union to prioritize managed withdrawals and diplomatic solutions over the costly extension of proxy conflicts. Cuba, which had borne the brunt of overseas troop commitments, faced its own economic and political limits and began to reassess the costs of sustained military deployments thousands of kilometers from Havana. Internationally, the late 1980s saw a growing appetite for negotiated settlements that could end active hostilities while addressing core political questions such as Namibian independence. Diplomacy moved fitfully but decisively. The Brazzaville Protocol, negotiated amid intense pressure and complex bargaining, linked the withdrawal of Cuban forces from Angola with a timetable for Namibian independence. The logic was explicit: remove foreign troops from Angolan soil, guarantee the security of the region, and create the conditions for a supervised transition in Southwest Africa. Contemporaneous accounts emphasize that the agreement did not emerge from a single stroke, but from overlapping negotiations involving Angola, Cuba, South Africa, the United States, and multiple African intermediaries. The linkage between Cuban withdrawal and Namibian independence was controversial in Pretoria. Some leaders perceived it as surrendering leverage, while others saw it as a pragmatic way to end a costly confrontation. Over time, the diplomatic momentum, fueled by shifts in Soviet policy and by mounting military and economic pressures, made the protocol an achievable outcome. The final months of the conflict's active phase were a mix of tense standoffs, reciprocal de-escalatory moves, and carefully choreographed withdrawals.
Cuban forces, in line with negotiated timetables and overseen by international observers at various stages, began to demobilize and withdraw. South African forces stood down from some of their longer excursions, and the diplomatic framework that had been hammered out in the late 1980s began to hold. Namibia moved toward a process of transition under international supervision, culminating in the territory's recognized independence. The sequence from battlefield to negotiation to settlement, taken together, demonstrates the interplay between military stalemate and political accommodation. When the price of continued fighting rose above perceived benefits, political actors found negotiated alternatives. If the immediate military episodes defined the visible contours of the conflict, the war's deeper consequences were less amenable to tidy accounting. South Africa paid a material price. The conflict required significant expenditures of money, materiel, and manpower. However strong the apartheid state's economy had seemed in earlier decades, the war exerted a long-term drain. Conscription raised political tensions within white South African society. Casualties and the recurrent return of young men from Angola shaped domestic conversations in ways that eroded popular acceptance for endless foreign engagements. More importantly, the reputational damage of repeated cross-border operations, seen by many as violations of sovereign borders and as exploitations of military superiority, accelerated Pretoria's diplomatic isolation. Economic sanctions, arms embargoes, and cultural boycotts were not singularly decisive on their own, but in concert with political pressure, they constricted the apartheid regime's room to maneuver. Regionally, the conflict reshaped political trajectories. Namibia's independence altered southern Africa's map and weakened Pretoria's ability to use the territory as a secure platform for security operations. Angola's civil war continued to have internal dynamics after the main international negotiations, but the consolidation of the MPLA regime, backed at critical moments by Cuban and Soviet assistance, changed the geopolitical balance in southern Africa. Movements like UNITA and external proxies found that continued armed resistance came at evolving costs and diminishing external appetite for unlimited backing. The Soviet Union's eventual collapse and Cuba's shifting resources further recalibrated support networks across the region. Beyond geopolitical and economics, the human toll was and remains incalculable in moral terms. Tens of thousands were killed, wounded, uprooted, or forced into prolonged displacement across southern Africa. Refugee camps became semi-permanent fixtures. Entire communities were transformed by years of intermittent warfare.
The war's footprint extended into lives and livelihoods in ways that statistical tabulation struggles to capture: interrupted education, trauma among survivors, land abandoned to insecurity, and the erosion of trust among neighbors. Moreover, contested incidents, where one side's security narrative clashed with another's humanitarian account, left lingering grievances that have complicated reconciliation and memory. Historians and investigators in the decades after the conflict have repeatedly grappled with the murky zones of responsibility and the difficulty of reconstructing objective narratives from partisan sources. Events like Kasinga, attacks on refugee camps, allegations of abuses by counterinsurgency units, and covert procurement operations all demanded careful archival work, cross-referencing of eyewitness testimony, and cautious interpretation. The consensus among many scholars is not a simple moral verdict on a single actor, but a more complex assessment. Apartheid South Africa pursued a militarized foreign policy that produced tangible security outcomes in the short term, but also generated profound moral, legal, and political costs. Those costs contributed to the weakening of the very regime that ordered them. The presence of superpower actors added layers of distortion. Cold War logic elevated local conflicts into theaters for global contestation, encouraging escalations that local dynamics alone might not have required.
It is also necessary to consider the internal political ripples within South Africa. The war in Angola was never solely an external campaign. It resonated inside South African political debates about national identity, economic priorities, and the sustainability of apartheid itself. Military expenditure diverted resources from social and economic programs. Mounting casualties and the visibility of conscripted young men returning in body bags strained the social compact that the regime had relied upon. The narrative of total strategy that had justified cross-border intervention increasingly collided with the practical recognition that endless confrontation could not be sustained without transforming the state, and ultimately prompting internal reform or collapse. For some in the regime's security apparatus, the war's hardened resolve to cling to control. For others, they highlighted the need to find a political settlement that could offer a stable regional order without continuous armed engagement. There are deeper institutional legacies as well. The conflict accelerated the professionalization and technical skill of parts of the SADF, led to innovations in counterinsurgency doctrine, and fostered networks of clandestine procurement that left traces in South Africa's defense industrial base. Those capabilities were later repurposed in different political contexts and sometimes led to ethical and legal quandaries in the post-apartheid era.
Moreover, the conflict accelerated patterns of militarized governance in neighboring states and entrenched paramilitary relations that complicated peacetime demobilization efforts. Yet the war's conclusion, and the diplomatic framework that made it possible, also illustrates an enduring truth of international politics. Military force can shape bargaining positions, but it rarely provides the final answer to deeply political conflicts. The linkage crafted in the Brazzaville negotiations between the withdrawal of foreign troops and Namibian independence recognized that sovereignty and security were intimately connected. When the international order shifted, and when the primary external backers recalibrated their commitments, the conditions for a negotiated settlement began to emerge. For many actors on the ground, negotiation was the only route to ending protracted suffering and to opening space for a political future that did not depend on continuous external military support. Reflecting on the dark truth promised by the title requires balancing these complex strands. On one level, the dark truth is literal and immediate. An apartheid state extended its security imperative across borders, and in doing so caused or was implicated in events that brought significant civilian harm, provoked international condemnation, and deepened its isolation. Covert operations, parachute assaults, and cross-border raids did not occur in a moral vacuum. They were choices with consequences for civilians, regional diplomacy, and the legitimacy of the actors who ordered them. On another level, the darker truth is systemic. Cold War geopolitics afforded local actors both the resources to resist and the means to escalate. Superpower competition blurred moral clarity and prolonged conflicts that might otherwise have found internal political resolutions. The involvement of Cuba and the Soviet Union in Angola, and of the United States in supporting anti-communist proxies at various times, turned a regional struggle for independence and power into a proxy arena where strategic logic often outweighed humanitarian concerns. Finally, the legacy can be read through the lens of outcomes. Namibia gained its independence, Cuban troops eventually withdrew under negotiated terms linked to that process, the MPLA remained in power in Luanda, and the regional map was redrawn. But the human and moral aftershocks of a decade and more of intervention left scars that went beyond territory. The reputational cost to South Africa contributed to internal pressures that, along with economic and political changes, helped to push the country towards transformation. For Angola, the war entrenched political divisions and prolonged a civil conflict whose ripples extended into the 1990s and beyond. For the wider world, the conflict offered a cautionary tale about the limits of militarized policies designed to preserve unjust domestic orders. As with many complex historical episodes, definitive moral verdicts are not simple to deliver. What is clear is that South Africa's war in Angola cannot be understood simply as a sequence of military successes and failures. It was a confluence of strategic choices, international entanglements, and human decisions, some tactical, some bureaucratic, some desperate, that together produced outcomes neither fully predicted nor entirely controllable. The dark truth is therefore as much about the moral compromise inherent in choosing force over negotiation as it is about the concrete costs paid by communities across Southern Africa. That legacy matters for how we remember and learn from the past. It presses contemporary observers to ask uncomfortable questions about when and how states use military power beyond their borders, about the ethical responsibilities of external patrons who provide arms and troops, and about the need for transparent accountability when civilian harm accompanies security objectives. It also reminds us that negotiations, diplomacy, and political accommodation, however unsatisfying they may appear to some actors at particular moments, offer routes away from cycles of violence that military solutions alone cannot break.
If this account leaves the viewer with a final, sober image, let it be this: a region hollowed by prolonged conflict, where the political map was ultimately redrawn less by decisive battlefield triumphs than by exhausted states, shifting global priorities, and the determined agency of political movements that refused to settle for subjugation. The paratroopers, the artillery barrages, the diplomatic cables, and the refugee streams are all part of the same story, a story in which Cold War logic metastasized into local catastrophe, and in which the moral costs of containment and repression were measured in lives, displacement, and long-lasting distrust. For those interested in tracing these events more granularly, operation by operation, map by map, and for viewers who want a comparative look at how similar dynamics played out in neighboring theaters, there are related examinations of Rhodesia's insurgency and the broader patterns of Cold War Africa that shed additional light on the network nature of these conflicts. If you want to explore those connections and continue the chronology with detailed sourcing, watch the companion videos on Rhodesia and Cold War interventions in Southern Africa to see how these threads interweave and to understand the broader implications of proxy warfare in the Cold War era.